What's up? This is an engine. It needs to get finished. It needs to go over there. What's up, guys? Thanks so much for joining another episode of Cars, Bikes, and Coffee. I am Kurt. This engine needs to get done because this garage is turning into a mess. Pulled the engine out of the 240Z, and that is out, and so the engine bay is getting torn apart because we need to get that painted, and so that way we can get this engine put in there. So in this episode, we're going to finish putting together the engine, get all the bits on and in place, and then hopefully we'll get to painting this car engine bay. Stay tuned. We're going to start with the housing, and we've already gone through, cleaned it up. We even had a repair that we had to fix on the housing. And what we need to get from our gasket kit is the crankshaft front seal, which will go in here. And then we need the two pieces of gasket for the rear of the housing that fits against the block. Need some Permatex gasket maker, and this is the type for water pump and thermostat housing. That's number 22071. And then just a hammer or a mallet so we can softly place the seal in. So we're gonna softly tap the seal in, going around in circle form. So now we have the seal in. We want to make sure that it's nice and flush with the top and that the lip comes through on the back side just right. And so we're good there. So back to the block, what we want to do now is install the drive gear for the oil pump and distributor. And the key thing here is you'll notice a chamfer on one side and the other side is flat. This chamfer side needs to go towards the engine block. And as well, you want to make sure that it sits right up to the timing gear chain. And then the next piece is the oil slinger, and this will have the flange on the outside. So the next thing we need is the bolts for the housing, and if you went and cleaned all yours and are reusing, this is the time you'll want to find them and get them out. I went and purchased the engine bolt kit from Z-Car Depot. They're all stainless steel. It'll be a nice addition to the engine look. So now we need to find those bolts. Hey, that was pretty lucky. Here we go. So each package that they send, like this one says timing cover, they're all marked and they're grouped, and so that helps keeping it easy. So we just need to organize these, and you'll probably remember from tearing this apart that they give you about 500 different bolt sizes, and so we just want to make sure that we use the right ones. The other key part is we are going to be installing the water pump, and so we'll just want to do the main bolts that do not have to do with the water pump right now. Now we're going to go through and just clean the gasket surfaces with some solvent. I'm going to use rubbing alcohol. And same for the block. Now we're going to place the gaskets over the dowels. And for the left side, or the passenger side of the block, we're going to put our sealant on both sides of the gasket. Now that we have the sealant on both sides of our gasket, we're going to place that onto the block. And making sure it goes over the dowels. We're going to apply some petroleum jelly to the inside of the crankshaft seal. You can also use moly grease. Now we're going to put on the housing. And it might just take a little bit of persuasion. Now one thing I might suggest, because there are so many different bolt lengths, some of them are pretty obvious, like these are the longest bolts and they go like so. There's another long one here on the bottom. But kind of going through it, and they should, you know, like this doesn't fit. There is one over here for that size, and they stick out before they start threading about a 1/2 inch. So best to kind of go through, find which bolt fits the sides the best, and then you can go back through and add your thread anti-seize. And then once you have all your bolts in and with their anti-seize on, we're going to just snug these up. Now we're going to torque the large bolts, which there are 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to torque those to 7.2 to 12 foot-pounds of torque. And the small ones, the two on the bottom, these two, this one, they will go to 2.9 to 7.2 foot-pounds of torque. Now we're going to put these two bolts in that connect the head to the timing cover. If you're using the stainless steel kit, these would be marked head to front timing cover. We're going to put these together and then put a little bit of anti-seize lubricant on, and then we're going to torque, at least this bolt will be torqued down to 2.9 to 7.2 foot-pounds of torque. This one's almost impossible because of the timing chain inspection cover, so you just want to get a feel for where about that torque is. Now we're going to install the harmonic balancer. So now that we have the damper pulley on, we are going to put Loctite on the bolt and then torque down the bolt to 101 to 116 foot-pounds of torque. And when torquing down the bolt, a good idea is to put a piece of 2x4 or some kind of wood in between the crankshaft throws, or you can place 2 bolts on the flywheel and put a bar in between to hold as a lever. Now we're going to flip the engine upside down and install the oil pickup and the oil pan. So we have our engine flipped over, and now we just want to take a final inspection of all the internals, just make sure everything looks good, and we are ready to put in the pickup tube. And we need our gasket, and then our pickup tube that's been cleaned, and we blew air through it just to make sure all is good with it, and then our 2 bolts. And we're not going to be applying any sealer to this gasket. And once we have the bolts hand tight, we're going to torque them at 7 foot-pounds. This is a great time to make sure your timing chain has a bit of oil or even assembly lube on it. So we'll do that, but we're also going to clean the oil pan surface so we can get ready for the gasket sealer and as well getting that installed. So now that the surface is clean, we're going to apply some gasket sealer on the rear main cap and on the front housing where they meet the block. We'll place the gasket, then the oil pan, and you want to make sure that your oil pan inside is all nice and clean. And then as well, we're going to put on the additional pieces such as the heat shield for the gasket and the brace, and then install all of the bolts, about roughly hand tight. Now that we have all of our bolts in and snug, we're going to go and torque them to 4 to 7 foot-pounds. Now that we have all our bolts torqued, want to make sure you have your oil pan drain bolt in. We're going to flip the engine upright and then start installing all the bits and pieces to the head. The oil pump, water pump, some of the cover pieces. For the 280ZX engine, there's no mechanical fuel pump, so the spot where it would go is actually sealed. But just to make it look a little nicer, we have the block off plate. And if you had the mechanical fuel pump, then and you're going to an electric fuel pump, then you definitely would want one of these. Next is the cam cover, and we just have a seal and a plate. And then 4 to 7 foot-pounds of torque. Now we're working on the water pump, and we'll want to get our gasket and our water pump. And if you're using the existing water pump, you just want to make sure that there's no play in the spinning of the tumbler. Otherwise, we're putting in a brand new one, so we're going to put sealer on both sides of the gasket and get that installed, and then snug up the bolts. Now that the bolts are all snugged up, we will torque the 6mm bolts to 3 to 7 foot-pounds and the 8mm to 8 to 12 foot-pounds. Now we're putting the brass fitting for the rear of the head for the heater inside the car, and we're using some Permatex high temperature thread sealant. We want this to be facing slightly up. Right about there. So now we're going to move to the oil sensor and oil switch. We're installing a switch because now we're going to have an electric fuel pump. So we'll want to put these in both with the high temperature thread sealant. Okay, now we need to install the coolant inlet. That will go right here. So we need to put in the gasket. We are going to put some sealer on it, and then we're going to torque down the bolts to 7 to 12 foot-pounds of torque. Now we move to the driver's side of the engine, and we're going to install the distributor adapter, which for this gasket does not require any sealant. And then we'll install the bottom half of the thermostat housing. And one item to note is just be careful of the length of bolt for the front. You don't want that to run into the timing chain guide. Now that we have those installed and the bolts are snugged up, we're just going to torque the bolts down to 7 to 12 foot-pounds. Now we want to install the thermostat, and we're using Stant Superstat 45858, a little better performance than their others. And we're going to install that with the gasket and then the spring down. And of course, we want to run sealant on both sides of that gasket. Now we're just going to torque these bolts to 7 to 12 foot-pounds. Now we're going to put in the exhaust manifold studs, and there are 11 of them, and we're going to just put some anti-seize lubricant and just get them real hand tight. Alright, so now we're going to go to the oil pump, and we just need to gather our bolts, our gasket, and our oil pump distributor shaft. And first things we want to do is put some assembly lube. Just make sure that's all covered. And then we need to prime the oil pump. And in order to prime it, what we're going to do is we're going to fill this large hole using some SAE 30 and just very carefully pouring in. I'm just turning the shaft just to get it through all the gears. Now that we have our oil pump primed, we have one of our bolts in the housing, and our distributor oil pump shaft is lubed and inserted. We have aligned the indent on the gear to the oil squirt hole. We are going to insert the pump. And then we are going to turn the pump to the right, just about a half a bolt hole, so towards the front of the engine, to engage the gear. And then we'll drive in the bolt, snug it, and check our results in the distributor side. And if we look, we have the offset of the tang towards the front of the engine, and if you were to line a pick or a screwdriver to the rear of the bolt hole and the front of the lower, that it aligns. So we are good. So now we can go ahead and install the other bolts and torque those to spec. Now we're going to just torque the bolts to 8 to 11 foot-pounds. There are some obvious things that we need to do yet on this engine, and we're going to do that after they are installed. The intake, the header, the cam cover, we don't want to scratch that when we're installing it. But what we want to do to finish up the video is we're going to put in our oil filter. And to do that, we are going to, of course, put a light coat of oil on the filter and then just fill up the filter just with a little bit of oil, just so it has some for when it starts. So we need to get this engine bay finished, and basically we need to just tear apart a few more things, get it all cleaned up, and then painted. We'll also need to take out the front end so we can paint those items and change out bushings and get it sorted. And then once that happens, we can put that engine in and hopefully it'll start. So thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to see more of these, please subscribe, and also don't forget to leave a like. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below.